share the screen and start off right there. And hopefully you guys can see the screen. So we're actually on part 7, believe it or not. And I was looking, we're going to probably have at least, 5 or 6 more sessions. And hopefully that's okay with everyone. We will take a break probably in early August, where my wife and I are trying to decide if we're going to go on a vacation away or not. Not a vacation, but to try to get our 3 daughters together. We have one who lives up in Michigan, so it's a little bit of a challenge. We're not sure if we're going to pull it off. If we do, we'll do like an RV trip to my parents' RV, so we'll see. But in that case, I would miss a week more than likely. So we'll see where we go, but I think we will certainly be going through August, and then we'll decide if we're going to do Reconstruction or not, or if we will pause there and shift to another period of time, another topic of time. So as you may remember last time, where we kind of stopped off, we'd seen the first major battle, Battle of Bull Run, or the Battle of Manassas, the first battle. And I mentioned to you already that when you study the Civil War, you'll find that many of the battles, we'll see one of them tonight, ends up with 2 names. There's a name that the Confederacy considered the battle, and historians have usually remembered that. And there's other name that the Union. That's usually the name I will go with in most cases. Some battles just have the one name. So what we saw was kind of a clash between 2 disorganized, inexperienced armies, and that showed up on the battlefield. And neither side really did all that well. And what we also noted was that it was very, very bloody. It'll turn out to not be bloody compared to what we're going to see and the country's going to experience. But for that moment, it seemed, really, really bloody in American history. And so it's very, very sobering for people, which is one of the reasons why through the rest of 1861, there's just really not much that happens. There's no major battles of any significance. There's the continued campaigning in Western Virginia, which the Confederacy will lose out to. More significantly, Robert E. Lee comes across as very unsuccessful there. He will say that was because of the inexperience of the troops. The press will eat him alive. The free press in the South will be as vicious or as focused, as determined, as whatever word you want to come up with, as it is in the North. If one of the things Lincoln and Jefferson Davis have in common is how vilified they often were in the press. Neither man, if you read the press of the time, neither man was a good leader, a good president. Lee will get attacked. He'll be called Granny Lee. He'll be called Ditch Digging Lee. And basically he's benched, which is really ironic because obviously when you ask the casual observer about the Civil War, their ideas will be that it's Lee. They may know Grant's name and Lee's, but Lee's one of the names they'll know. And you may hear somebody who thinks they know more about military, and they'll tell you things like, oh, Lee was our best general, maybe in all of American history. And yet when the war begins, for his team, he's on the sidelines. He's not involved. He fails in holding the western part of Virginia, although he's not the reason it was lost. It had been lost subsequently before that. But nonetheless, he's seen as guilty. And so he's basically in Richmond for the rest of 1861 and into most of 62, or at least the first half, just as Jefferson Davis's advisor. However, in the West, we see the fact that the Union Army is moving to some degree. The Missouri campaign goes well for the Union Army, and basically the upper Mississippi going north from, say, Tennessee's border with Kentucky was largely owned by the Union Army, and they were already beginning to make plans to come south. The Confederacy's choice to invade Kentucky was very momentous because Lincoln had accepted Kentucky's neutrality and had promised to not be on their land. But when the Confederacy chose to invade Kentucky in order to try to get to the Ohio River as a protection, build some forts, that turned things around so that the Union Army was able to actively move within Kentucky. And many generals, and Grant, I only mention Grant here in November of 61 because of who he becomes later. But Grant will have his first action in the western part of Kentucky and really near Missouri, but the part of Missouri and Kentucky kind kind of connect. And then we ended seeing the fact that there was a diplomatic blow up, which, just remember, this is really the main point for the Confederacy. While they're adopting early a defensive campaign, the idea that they're assuming that the North does not fully want to fight, and therefore if they just kind of, status-wise set up a way to defend themselves, ultimately the North will back off. At the same time, their main option, or the main way they're going to win, is to mimic what the Americans had done in 1776, which is get foreign help. And of course, you want, if you're going to try to secede from a country like Catalan is trying to do from Spain, you need help. You want a big country to help. If the United States recognized Catalan as an independent nation over there on the Iberian Peninsula in the year 2020, that would be significant. Or if China did it, because those are obviously major countries, so that Spain would feel less confident about going to war, if necessary, to kind of control their own territory. So the Confederacy wants England in particular. Now, France at this point is not as strong as she had been after the French Revolutionary period. And then she's had some tumult. The year 1848 was really revolutionary, but there'd already been 3 or 4 other revolutions in France between the French Revolution and now in the 1860s. And so France is not very strong, but she is eager to join in. She just won't move without England. She doesn't want to get crossways with England. Fortunately for Lincoln, as I told you last time, John Adams' grandson, John Quincy Adams' son, Charles Francis, is our diplomat in England, and he's able to barely keep things calm. Lincoln really moved quickly to try to satiate the British, saying famously, let's have one war at a time. But you can imagine, had England gotten involved and had Lincoln chosen to continue to fight, what that would portend is the potentiality of a war on 2 fronts. So potential Canadian, British invasion somewhere in the North, if nothing more than to just keep the Union Army divided. So we solved that problem, and we roll into 1862. But one other thing that's happening in 1861 that's worth noting is the fact that the issue of slavery doesn't go away, and it will simmer through. Now, remind yourself that Lincoln, as a Republican, is the leader of the abolition political party. It's the party that has a long history trying to work its way to getting the country to eliminate slavery. The last 2 of those parties, the Free Soil Party and the Republican Party, made their most open statements about stopping slavery in the territory, in the new territories. So no advancing of slavery. But nonetheless, they wanted desperately to try to stop slavery in the South. Well, now that the southern states have left, when you look at Congress, it is an overwhelmingly large Republican majority. So these abolitionists are now in a position where they can act to try to make this happen. Now, what's interesting is watching Lincoln's own wrestling, which we'll come back to this in a moment later in the hour. So one of the first things that happens is along the coastline, much like we saw in Fort Sumter, there were a few other forts where the Union Army was able to hold its position. So one of those is near Yorktown, Fort Monroe, named obviously after the president. And the Confederacy never had the capacity, naval or army, to go and conquer it. So there was always a Union presence there. This will also happen in a few other places. Missouri's another example, down on the North Carolina coast and the Outer Banks. Well, at Fort Monroe is General Butler, as you can see, and he made a decision to declare that all of the slaves who came to him were contraband of war. Now, this was a very kind of interesting way of looking at what he's trying to do here. But he reasoned that if the South, which they did, typically considered slavery property, and if in a war we could take a mule or cattle or crops as contraband from someone, even a civilian, to further the war effort, then why not take the slaves? Lincoln does not stop him on this point. And as you can see in August, Congress will join with him and they will pass what is the first of a few confiscation acts, basically telling their commanders, yeah, do that, go and take this. Now this is, as the Union Army moves through the South, this will increasingly become a problem for the South and an opportunity for African Americans. As if they can get to the Union Army, then the great likelihood is they will be received and accepted. Now, it's not like they're just set free and off to the north, they're put to work. But for many African Americans, it was a work connected to liberty and freedom. They weren't slaves anymore, and so it was very rewarding. Well, in that same month of August, in Missouri, Union General Fremont, who you may remember was the presidential candidate for the Republicans in 1856. So he, as a general in Missouri, just declares an open proclamation, an Emancipation Proclamation throughout the state. Now remember, Missouri is a border state, and Lincoln had worked really diligently with the 4 remaining border states to keep them in. And so one of the things he had said in his inauguration is that there's no plans from the federal government to take your slaves or your property from you. So now he's got a problem. And as you can see, ultimately, he will rescind Fremont's order. Now, Fremont will still stay in the Army for a while, but ultimately he will complain often to the press or to friends who will also complain in the press. So Lincoln will have him removed from office. So it's kind of interesting. So I just want to not kind of lock this away, because you know where we're headed. We're going to turn to 1862, and when we do, we're heading towards the Emancipation Proclamation at the end of that year. So we want to kind of keep in mind and see if we can kind of get a grip on what's Lincoln doing. It's a very complicated thing. I think a way to look at it is Lincoln's own views are evolving, and at the same time, he's thinking, what do I need to do to win? So as you can see, his concern is not first what would be best for the slaves of Missouri. His concern is first what is going to be best for maintaining the Union as it relates to the border states. So what happens as we move in? Well, remember, George McClellan was put in charge, as I just showed you. Now, he and Lincoln had one of the most amazing relationships of generals. Remember, I told you last time that both Lincoln and Davis are not sure exactly how they should act. With our first war post-revolution, well, actually the first war was under John Adams, the quasi-war with France. But the first official war was the War of 1812. And then, of course, the Mexican War happens 30-something years later. In both those wars, the presidents largely are not actively involved. And yet here, Davis, because of his military background, and Lincoln has a military background, though more as a volunteer, but Lincoln more so because of what he perceives to be the inadequacies of his generals. Both are very involved. Both have another problem in that in both settings, it's mostly a volunteer army. We can't really imagine that today. At no point in the Iraq struggle or the war on terror that we've gone through, for really the last 19 years, have local politicians, raise the unit from Winter Park or Orlando or Orange County or Seminole County, and then, chose to just march off to war to join the war effort, right? That's the way it was before, but after World War II, that really all changes. But before World War II, you really did have this idea of you could, if you had enough money or you had enough influence, you could create your own unit and gather people around you from your local area and march off to war. And so what this often did, though, for both Davis and Lincoln is put them in a situation where you had military leaders like Lee or Grant or McClellan who were West Point graduates. But then you had other people who were, their only claim to fame was they were political. They either were rich or they had been a senator or representative, or their dad was a senator, or their dad was the governor, and they just wanted to get involved. And yet their track record as military people was spotty, as we might imagine. There were a few that stood out, but there were others that weren't so much. So there was a constant sense where the presidents were always involved. You can imagine from the general's point of view, it's meddling. And even Grant will talk about this to some degree, although Lincoln, by the time Grant's in charge in 64, largely stays out of it, though we'll come back to that when we get to 64. So Lincoln is desperate for action. You always have to remember with Lincoln is he's the president of a third party who successfully becomes the leader. There's no history with this party. There's not like a longevity issue. He can't turn back to former presidents from the political party to give him advice. There's a lot of which, remember the run between 56 and 60, when you get Dred Scott and then the Oberlin Wellington rescue and the raid on Harper's Ferry, a lot of explosive things led to the success of the Republicans in 1860. It wasn't like they just were, for 2 decades, increasingly stronger politically, right? So Lincoln realizes his position is tenuous. I mean, it's obviously tenuous because the Civil War's happened. So what's going to happen next? We don't know what's going to happen next. You have to always remind yourself, when you're sitting with Lincoln in December of 61, you don't know that they're going to win. Now, I can say as a historian that, the Union could never have lost, which militarily they really could not have lost. And as more famous historians than myself have said, the Union was really fighting one hand tied behind it. Had England gotten involved and invaded us from the north, it still would have been something we could have taken on with our industrial might and our manpower numbers. England could not have gotten enough people over here to really have majorly impacted the war. At least it doesn't seem that way, right? So, but they don't know that in 1861, in December of 61. So Lincoln is obviously fraught with concern as to how things are going to go. So McClellan takes over. And remember what I told you, McClellan is an excellent administrator. He's an excellent kind of organizer. He'd have been an amazing quartermaster for the Army, but he wasn't a good battlefield general. And that's obviously an important factor for the person who's going to lead the Army into battle or lead the Navy. You need somebody who's able to fight and willing to do it. And I'm not saying I could do it. History is replete with several people from other nations who turns out when they get into the thick of battle, they're not very good. And I'm sure, in fact, I probably would not be very good. It's easy to sit in your chair and go, I'd be fine, or I'd do this, or I'd do that. But in the heat of the moment, it takes a certain set of skill. And McClellan, bless his little heart, he just didn't have it. And really the nice way I like to say it is that he worked hard at getting his new toy, his new car all shiny, and he didn't want to get it dirty. And so he doesn't do anything. He probably could have launched an attack in the fall of 61. Certainly by October, the weather still would have been okay. He doesn't. Lincoln's like, what's going on? And part of what McClellan's problem was that he had his own intel, and the intel that he had was inaccurate. And he was easily misled through spy work, basically, to where he consistently overinflated the enemy's numbers and then wanted to have more. Now, again, I'm not expecting you to know a lot about battle, and we're not going to go too deep in tactics, but the short version is it's like a math equation. So if you're going to be the attacker, you want to have at least 2-to-1 odds, 2 of your troops for every 1 of theirs. If it's 1-to-1 odds, that's a really risky maneuver unless you can outmaneuver them in some way. And there's other factors we'll talk about later that get into how you do the math. If there's hills or rivers or mountains, other factors play a role in the story. And McClellan consistently had 2, if not in sometimes 3-to-1 odds, which militarily you just go for it. You don't really, 3-to-1 odds, you don't really have to think all that much about, just send everybody out. But if you're afraid for that, and maybe there's a part for McClellan, again, we want to honor his thought process, maybe there's a sensitivity to, I don't want people to die. Well, that's great. I mean, hopefully a lot of us think that way, right? But if you're a general, you can't think like that. You can think I want less of my people to die, but some of them are going to die. And that's just the way it works. And so McClellan never could do that. And so he desperately struggled to figure out what to do. I think he also might have been guilty of reading his press. If you read his letters, he had a high opinion of himself. And he was often nicknamed Little Napoleon. So I think that might have gone to his head. And so he starts designing these massive, massive campaigns. Lincoln later will tell him, you're trying to avoid battle when you just need to go ahead and go out there. But he comes up with this plan here that he would try to sneak around. So up here on the map, here's Manassas right here, right? So the Confederacy under General Joe Johnston, who we've already met, was here. And Lincoln was like, just march out. You already outnumber them. Go out there. And McClellan's like, no, no, no. I will try and sneak down this way and come in. There's Fort Monroe, where we saw the thing with the slaves. And so I'll come here and march this way. This is roughly 60-ish miles between here. This is where Yorktown is. This is where Williamsburg is. So, you know, a lot of really early things. Jamestown's down here. If you ever go, it's, you know, a great place to visit. It's probably about an hour, 60 miles, 45 miles. An army could march it if they were not impeded in probably 4 days. You and I couldn't, but an army, military people who were trained. So that's his plan. So he's going to try to make that happen, but he still doesn't move. And you can see this back and forth between Lincoln and McClellan. And finally in March, he gets going, right? But when he does, Lincoln starts meddling again. And he meddles by removing him as general-in-chief. Now, I think this is a little unfair on Lincoln's part, but I think it reflects his frustration. He's just kind of over it with McClellan. Now, in McClellan's defense, a little bit, he couldn't just send his transports out there because there's been a new development in the U.S. Civil War involving shipping. And it comes down to the idea that for the first time, there were going to be ships made out of metal or iron. Ironclads is what they're typically called. Most of them are like this. This is the Monitor and the Merrimack. The Monitor is the little guy there with the little thing on top. The Merrimack or the Virginia was what it was first. Merrimack's what we always called it because it was first a Union ship. Had the more of the kind of larger shape, as you can see here in the pictures. And this will transform naval warfare. Now, the ironclads, these two are not the very first ironclads. There were some in the U.S. Navy in the previous year in '61, but this battle between them is the first one where it's only ironclad ships fighting each other. And the Virginia, more appropriately called, I guess, was blocking where the James River, which is where Fort Monroe is. And so we had to deal with that. They dealt with it with their own ironclad, the USS Monitor. I think it's a good spot here just to point out and tell you that the way I look at the modern age, the Civil War is the first modern war. Now, typically, if you know your World War I story, it's often talked about that it's the first industrial war, which it is, and that the industrial technology transformed warfare, making it far more bloody. And you hear about machine guns and poison gas and airplanes and you know, rapid communication and artillery from 2 miles away and trenches and that kind of stuff. Well, the U.S. Civil War had all that stuff in its very embryonic form. No, we didn't have airplanes, but we used balloons to get us a visual from the sky. We had, you know, we didn't have radios at that point, but we still had the telegraphs, almost instantaneous communication. Down the list, you can go with everything you see, or almost everything you see in World War I, that was in its initial phases in World War II, I mean, in the Civil War. So the Merrimack and the Monitor go at it with each other right off Hampton Roads, which again, here's Fort Monroe on this map. So this is the James River. It's going to go up towards, well, it goes up towards Petersburg, a little south of Richmond. But this is where McClellan wants to land. And so he eventually they fight, and it's really just a draw, but it does clear the way for his ships to begin going, and he will begin going. All right. Now we're going to leave McClellan kind of moving his forces because at this moment, the bigger action happens in the West. And so in the West, there's a series of Union forces in a variety of places. People like Grant, who's a brigadier general, so he's got his own little army, but it's small, who are looking for things to do. And one of the things about Grant, particularly compared to McClellan, is that Grant just believed there needed to be action. And he believed at this point, Grant still is in the crowd who thinks one big battle should end it, and maybe Bull Run wasn't big enough. He'll be disabused by that notion soon. But so he wants to act. And so far what he's done has kind of led to successes in very small levels of Paducah, Kentucky, and Cairo, and at Belmont. So he's like, let's get going. And Grant noticed that the Confederacy, in trying to protect Tennessee, had done a poor job of building its two forts. You can see Fort Henry here on the Tennessee River and Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River. And they look close on this map, but technically they could have been built a little closer together so the two forts could have coordinated their defense. And where the Confederacy put them, obviously rapidly in a year, was not close enough. So Grant realized he could take one at a time. And so he organized a joint operation, one of the first, if not the first in US history, joint operations, Army and Navy, to working together. He worked with the naval officer Foote to take Henry. Now, Henry was an easy capture. Donelson becomes more difficult because the Confederacy reinforces it. But ultimately, he will surround Fort Donelson. And even though the Confederacy counterattacks and has a moment to break out, they don't. And Grant sees it. One of the cool things about Grant was that he was very calm under pressure in battle. He never seemed rattled. And so he, basically counterattacked their attack and bottled them up. It turns out the Confederacy had a problem. Again, back to the political generals. There were 3 men who were in the fort who were claiming they were in control. So you have this kind of comedy of errors of who's really in charge. Nathan Bedford Forrest, who you may remember more famously for the leadership of the Ku Klux Klan, he was there as well. And eventually he decides these guys are all 3 losers, I'm out. So he took his cavalry guys and he just left. His cavalry just rode away. And ultimately, it was a friend of Grant. Remember, these guys all know each other from the Mexican War previously, who ends up with the job of surrendering. And when he sent out a message, and what are your, conditions for surrender? What he assumed was one where we're friends, and so maybe Grant will be nicer to us. But what he also assumed was the norm. The norm was you would always, okay, do this, and we'll do this, and we'll do that, and you can do this, and you can't go there. Usually they would think about trying to parole soldiers, which is like go home, and then the suggestion would be don't fight again. But of course, nobody's watching, so of course you could come back and fight again, and many would do that. Grant sends back, I'm gonna read it to you from my notes here. He sends back, I have no terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move attack immediately upon your works, meaning your defensive stuff. Well, his friend, Buckner is his last name, Simon Buckner, he's caught off guard. He can't believe this. So listen to what he writes back. He says, the distribution of the forces under my command and the overwhelming force under your command compel me to accept the ungenerous and unchivalrous terms you propose. He was frustrated. Later, the 2 men will meet up like the next day. Grant claimed he didn't know it was Buckner, and Buckner's like, if I'd been in charge, this wouldn't happen. And Grant's like, if you'd have been in charge, I probably wouldn't have done it the same way. But the point is made that from Grant's point of view, the only way we're going to win this is with no conditions. You guys have committed treason. There's no conditions here. The press picks up on this and runs with it and takes his initials US to begin to stand for unconditional surrender, Grant. And so Grant gets a kind of an aura of fame at this moment. Now, it'll only be for a moment, right? Fame is fleeting, particularly with the press, right? He camps in southern Tennessee at a place called Pittsburgh, not Pittsburgh with the G like we know in Pennsylvania, but Pittsburgh Landing, which is down here south. Now, they've got the word Shiloh here. That's not a place. They're just showing you Shiloh because you probably know that's where the battle happens. When he camps down here, because he wants to go to Corinth. If you look at Corinth, you can see these lines, there's no roads. Everything happened from a transportation point of view on the rivers and on the railroad. So Grant realized if he could take Corinth, it would capture and break a major east-west railroad. Well, of course, the Confederacy knows this also. And so Jefferson Davis has placed what he would say was his best general, that's including Lee, Albert Sidney Johnston. Now, Johnston had been in California when the war began and had made his way back to the South and had joined up and stays in the West. Now, he didn't necessarily have a lot of great action to begin with. A lot of people thought he was wonderful. Others weren't so sure. And as you can see there, he'd actually had some mistakes. He's the one who led the invasion of Kentucky. So, he had some troops. He sent the troops to Donelson. That didn't work out. But he recognized at this moment that he has the same amount of troops. Now, earlier, remember I told you don't attack if it's 1-to-1 odds? Well, you do if you realize your enemy is going to get larger than you. And he knew that another army under Don Carlos Buell was coming down from Nashville with at least 20,000, possibly another 40,000 troops. So then it would be 2-to-1 for Grant. So Johnston's like, I'm not waiting. And so Johnston begins to move to Pittsburgh Landing. Now, this map is sideways. This is a map you can see if you ever go to Shiloh. It's a wonderful battlefield. It's not one of the more popular ones or not the more highly visited ones. So if you ever get a chance to go to southern, western Tennessee, you should go to it. And you'll see this map. I like turning it this way because it gives you a better view of where things are. So here's where the camps were. And if you kind of just back down to this corner, that's the way down towards where Grant's headquarters is and back towards the Tennessee River. This was like the outer level of the camps. I'll show you another map in a second, which you can see it. But I like this map because one of the things that's said often is Grant's troops were fully surprised. Well, they were caught off guard, and Grant could be held guilty of not having done enough to check where Johnston might have been. He was just assuming Johnston was going to be defending Corinth and did not give him credit that he might actually defend by attacking. But it wasn't like they were asleep on the job. It's early in the morning. It's about 5 a.m. So they have people on patrol. They do have what they call pickets is the word that's used, where you have a small group of soldiers who are out in front of the line or out in front of the camp. And they stumble into the Confederacy. It'd have been better for the Confederacy on that day had they not been out there, but they do. So there's some initial firing which wakes up some of the soldiers. So there's a little bit of an awake, but the attack is so early, of course, the Union Army is not assuming a battle is going to happen, that they're going to sweep past. The name comes from this little church. Now, this is a replica. The original got burned down. I don't think it did in the battle, but it did later. So this is a replica that's on the battlefield if you go there. And this is this Shiloh United Methodist Church. And so that's where the name kind of gets stuck, as it's kind of the original attack comes right by the church and becomes kind of this moment. It's actually they don't fight there very long by the church because the Confederacy is very successful sweeping down. And as you can see, kind of moving this way from Corinth, and they attack in this long line, and the Union Army is forced into a retreat. Sherman, who you'll know becomes Grant's right-hand man later, is just at this moment one of the commanders. And so he's over here on the Union right, the Confederate left. There's the Shiloh church, so kind of gets connected to Sherman, so to speak. They all end up in kind of a mass retreat. Now, what Johnston is thinking, and again, this is Albert Sidney Johnston, not the Joe Johnston over in Virginia, right? Is that they will push them to the river, and then it's such a long and wide river at that point. If they try to, escape on the river, they'll crush them. That he really thinks we can capture all or most of Grant's army. We got to get them to the river, and so they're off and running. Now, Grant, realizing that the battle started, very calm, begins making all the motions he needs to move. He's got a whole division that's north. Now, on this map, you can't see it because it's not on the map, but it'd be like north of the G here in Grant under a man named Lew Wallace. So he sends Wallace orders to come down here and meet up with Sherman. Unfortunately, Wallace, not this Wallace, another Wallace, he gets lost. So that guy doesn't come. So Grant's got to deal with this. Ultimately, right here in the center, this general, Prentice, gets to a spot that's on the other side of this peach orchard. So now I'm standing, when I'm taking this picture, at the edge of the hornet's nest. That's the peach orchard out there. The Confederacy's coming from those trees, and to the right of where I'm standing, or I'm at the end of what the hornet's nest is. And it was a sunken road. We're going to see this in a couple other battlefields as we go along. obviously, if you can imagine being in a sunken road that's, say, 2 or 3 feet deeper than the rest of the elevation, and all the Confederates are walking out here on the open ground, you've got a better advantage. You can shoot at them, and if they shoot back, maybe only your head is above ground. So it gives you a real opportunity to defend. And Prentiss will successfully kind of patch together a defense around the sunken road, again, right here in the center. And as they back up, the Confederates will sweep around them to their right and to their left down to the river, but they won't be able to take the sunken road, not for more than 6 hours. This allows Grant the time he needs. Now, Grant knows there's no reason to panic in a long-term view because he knows Don Carlos Buell's troops are not that far away. Obviously, riders were sent off to Buell as soon as the battle started, and so they're alerted and they're marching faster. They're not going to get there that day, but Grant realizes they're going to be there the next day. So he's got that kind of in his back pocket. Ultimately, it took about 10, 11, 12 different attacks. And finally, Albert Sidney Johnston got so frustrated, he rounded up all the artillery that he could get his hands on close enough, over 60 pieces, and aimed them at the sunken road. Now, so if you're looking at this picture, there's those same peaches trees that have been planted there by the battlefield. I was there probably 10 years ago, so maybe they're bigger now. But this is the peach orchard. He was standing back around here, and that dark wooded area is where the sunken road is. So he aims them all there, and he decides he's going to lead his men into battle because he's got to get to the river. When he does, he gets shot. He actually makes it in and out of the charge, but on his way out, he gets shot behind the knee, and he bleeds to death. He actually bleeds to death down this little valley. So where I'm standing here at this top picture, I'm looking at the sunken road. I just literally turned right around, and you can see it kind of goes downhill. There's a very famous picture, actually, at the moment when Johnston is dying, and it's down in this little area where you can see where he passed away. At that, the Confederacy's in trouble. Now, our old friend, PTG Beauregard, is there. Remember, he got shipped west because Davis doesn't like him. Well, so he was there. He was fighting as the number 2, and he takes over. So he keeps going, but by this point, it's late in the day. It's probably 6 or 7. There still were a couple hours. Jackson, Lee, they all would have kept, Grant would have kept pressing if he had been on the attack. But Beauregard's like, okay, look, we fought all day. We marched for a while to get here. We're all tired. We've got these guys. He actually wires Davis and goes, hey, a tremendous victory has been won. We lost Johnston. That's not good. But we're going to, it's over. We've won. Grant's probably going to run away tonight. That's kind of what he's thinking. Davis, by the way, was so broken up over the loss of Johnston. He said that our strongest pillar of our generals has been lost. Again, much more important to him than Lee. However, they didn't recognize who they were dealing with. Grant was not somebody who was easily going to be flustered, right? So it's interesting that the Union generals kind of agree with Beauregard because they were thinking we should get across the river. We made it through the day. We weren't all captured. Let's get out of here. And so they kind of convinced Sherman to be the one to go to Grant and bring it up, right? But Sherman doesn't want to just walk up and go, let's retreat. So he walks up. Grant never looks at him, Sherman says. And he's looking out over the battlefield. Now, all around them are wounded men moaning and sad and in pain and just the tragedy, right, of war. And Sherman walks up and he says, wow, Grant, we had the devil's own day, didn't we? And I think what Sherman was assuming is that Grant would go, yeah, that was rough. And then Sherman could say, maybe we should go to the other side of the river so tomorrow morning they cannot attack us, and we lose. Grant never looks at it, according to Sherman. He's chomping on his cigar, kind of the glare of the cigar lighting up his eyes, and he just looks at it and he goes, we'll lick them tomorrow. The stunningness of this in this man, there's actually this part in his own, I've got his memoirs right here. If you ever want to read, Grant's memoirs are really good. early in the war, before the Battle of Belmont, he talks about a time when he was leading his troops really for one of the very first times in potential battle. Turned out there wasn't a battle. The other guy ran away, but he said they were marching up a hill. And he says, we approached the brow of the hill from which it was expected we would see our enemy and possibly find his men. My heart kept getting higher and higher until it felt to me as though it was in my throat. I would have given anything then to have been back in Illinois. But I had not the moral courage to halt and think about it. I just kept right on. And he says, when they crossed the hill, it turns out that they had run away. And he says, my heart resumed its place. It occurred to me at once that Harris had been as much afraid of me as I had been of him. This was a view of the question I had never taken before, but it was one I never forgot afterwards. From that event to the close of the war, I never experienced trepidation upon confronting an enemy. Though I always felt more or less anxiety, I never forgot that he had as much reason to fear my forces as I had of his. The lesson was valuable, and it certainly was valuable. Sherman, maybe we should get out. There's other generals, definitely we should get out. When Don Carlos Buell shows up, he sends word, you don't want me to cross the river, right? You're going to come to me. And he's like, no, cross the river. We're going to attack in the morning. When he gets up that morning, he makes sure that his commanders realized, we're going to do to them what they did to us. You're going to attack at like 5 a.m. We will not wait. We won't give them a chance to even get started. He knew he had more troops, and he was eager to get into it. It was a stunning, stunning moment for Grant, and it was prescient. He was exactly right. He knew his enemy. He knew Beauregard was not as strong as Johnston. He knew that Beauregard, if they started losing ground, which they did, would retreat. And Beauregard, by really 3 in the afternoon, gives up. He doesn't even try to fight the rest of the day. He just bails. Now, in Beauregard's defense, he was now outnumbered about 2 to 1. So, of course, he ends up losing. That's not surprising. But Beauregard retreats back to Corinth, and the Union Army has technically won the day. Now, remember, when we talk about winning and losing, I know that is not a great way to think about it because we're talking about human life. But what is being discussed when there's winning and losing is who controls the ground and who lost the most people. So in this battle, as you can see, Grant's army lost more people. So technically you could claim Shiloh's a draw because the Union Army was still in command of the field and they were still in a position to pursue action. And in fact, Grant was prepared to march to Corinth when he was relieved of duty. Because of politics. His commanding officer, a man named Halleck, did not like him. Grant had to beg him 3 or 4 times back at Fort Henry to even launch those attacks, and Halleck did not want to get involved, and he was kind of a politically minded person himself, and so he's relieving Grant of duty because of the death total. Remember, the Bull Run the year before, the death total was about 4,000. Here, 23,000. And again, not death total, casualty total, sorry. Remember, the casualty total is deaths and is wounded and missing, right? But the 23,000 in casualties was more than the Revolutionary War, the Mexican War, and the War of 1812 combined. So if everybody panicked after Bull Run, right, so torn up over the death loss, imagine what happened now. And Grant goes from hero, unconditional surrender, Grant, woo, to villain, right? He's a butcher. He's a terrible general. Grant was someone who had had alcoholic problems before. And so in those alcoholic problems, there was always thoughts maybe when things go wrong for him, he's drinking. Now, there's no evidence he was drinking on the day before the Battle of Shiloh. However, that was the thought. So he gets attacked in the press, goes from hero to goat, just like that, and he's relieved of duty. He's not fully fired because Lincoln realizes in all his frustrations with McClellan, at least Grant does things. And Grant's not the only one doing things. You can see here, I'm not going to read all this to you, the Union Army is pulling off that first stage of their plan, which is splitting up the Confederacy. And you do that through the Mississippi River, and also the part about beginning to build the blockade. So they're able to take a series of cities, including Pensacola and Jacksonville, so for us here in Florida, those are important, in which they're able to kind of lock down the Confederacy. And losing New Orleans meant you pretty much have lost any hope of using the river for, getting materials in and out, from wherever, England or whoever helps you. Now, they haven't taken Vicksburg. This map's a little misleading because it goes ahead into 63. We're not going there tonight. But so when the year 62 comes to an end, the Union Army will be in control all the way down to roughly right about here, maybe a little north of Vicksburg, and then all the way up the river to right about there. Whoops, let's go back to right about there. So they've got that control. By holding Vicksburg, which we'll look at next week, I think, there's still east-west passage. But they basically have pulled off a lot. They'll eventually take Corinth, or actually Beauregard will just leave it. But they'll eventually force Confederate forces in Mississippi down to the center section around Jackson and Vicksburg itself. So there's a lot of success even beyond Grant. So now let's go back east, because now we've kind of caught up to where McClellan is. The same time the battle is going on for Shiloh, he's finally getting his troops down to Yorktown. And quite honestly, in McClellan's defense, he pulled it off. He actually did it. Johnston had actually retreated from Manassas down to the Rappahannock River, which is right here out of Fredericksburg, which we'll come back to that later. Some of you may know that battle already. But still, he doesn't know where McClellan is. So McClellan pulls it off, and he lands down here on the fort with a lot of troops. But notice what happens. It takes him 3 weeks really to get everybody there, and he doesn't march forward. He doesn't move at all, right? So you can see the difference between him and Albert Sidney Johnston, or between him and Grant. Finally, he's got most of his army, about 120,000 troops. Down here on the river, I'm going to go to the next slide, show you a map. Down here at the very end, there's Yorktown. The Confederates had near Yorktown an army of about 10,000 troops. Now think about the map I just told you. McClellan's got 120,000. The Confederacy has 10,000. It's 12-to-1 odds. McClellan just needs to keep walking. He doesn't even need to stop for this guy. Nobody's going to, well, somebody would get hurt, I'm sure. But ultimately, you're going to overwhelm them. But he won't attack. Now, this story is one of my favorite stories because I love how, unfortunately, it makes McClellan look bad. But ultimately, what happens is the Confederate general, actually, I'll put the slide back up again. What the Confederate general does is he had a history in drama, right? So he loved theatrics. So he had his 10,000 troops, broke them up into smaller groups, and basically for 4 or 5 days straight, marched them into town, separated by some distance, and, you know, swinging branches, making large noises, had his artillery spread way apart from each other and would randomly shoot one way over here, and then 5 minutes later, one over here. So to McClellan's ears, he's seeing just troops after troops. They've got artillery everywhere. And he never really investigates it. And he freezes for a month. He's frozen. Of course, in all that time, Magruder and the Confederacy now knows where McClellan is, and Johnston comes down and is able to take over defense on the peninsula. But remember, you and I, or a good military unit, could march from here to Richmond in probably 4 days. And there was literally nobody to stop McClellan, and he didn't do it. It's one of the great tragedies of the war, because he probably could have taken Richmond without any battle whatsoever, because Richmond was in no way as deeply defended with entrenchments and cannons as was DC. And McClellan had overwhelming odds, but he wouldn't go. Now, to some degree, as I'm saying here, there is some meddling by Lincoln that plays a role, kind of gets in the middle of things. Lincoln's unhappy with McClellan. McClellan's actually done some things that are pretty offensive to Lincoln. And we all like to think of Lincoln as being this magnanimous, kind of graceful person, but he's human. He gets his feelings hurt. So he actually pulls 30,000 troops away from the army, or doesn't let them go down under McDowell, the same guy we met in Bull Run, leaves him there to defend DC. And so that kind of has a little impact. But honestly, from the beginning, McClellan needed no more troops. Even when Johnston gets down there, he's got approximately 50,000 to McClellan's 120. So again, 2-to-1 odds. Just keep going. McClellan's not going to be able to stop you, and at least not really well. And he doesn't. And it's one of the great tragedies. Stonewall Jackson comes into his fame at this moment, which has an impact on Lincoln and the very famous Shenandoah campaign, Long story short, Jackson marches his 17,000 men all up and down this long valley here, which is sort of one of the breadbasket valleys for Virginia. And the three armies you can see there in blue, they can't catch him. And Lincoln's trying to give them orders when, of course, McClellan should have been giving them orders. And that's Lincoln's fault, not McClellan. Lincoln was basically giving orders and not telling McClellan. So again, not very good on Lincoln's part from kind of meddling. But eventually Jackson will get his 17,000 down to be with Johnson. And Johnson will get tired of waiting. McClellan does get to Richmond. Again, go back to this map here. He gets up to Richmond. You can see it. But he doesn't do anything. And if you notice here, he has troops on both sides of this river. Not really the best lineup. So at this point, Joe Johnston in charge says, okay, I'm done with this. We're attacking. He got tired of waiting. So he attacks McClellan. Again, you can see the difference in the two men. It's interesting. Well, I'll tell you that story in a second. Johnson fights May 31st, the Battle of Seven Pines. Now, the interesting thing about the Battle of Seven Pines is that Johnson gets seriously wounded, meaning, well, you might go, why, Carl? That's not very nice. Well, as you can see, this is the moment the Confederacy stumbles into that gives them Robert E. Lee as their commander. The whole rest of the mythology around Lee doesn't happen if Johnson's not wounded, because Davis didn't trust Lee either, not really. And Johnson had been doing a decent job in the war. And so he leaves Johnson in the battle. Johnson himself will say, the best thing I did was fight the Battle of Seven Pines and get hurt so Lee could take over. And Lee does take over. And he also recognizes McClellan is not worth waiting on. Now, it's interesting. Remember I told you Lee had the problems in West Virginia? Well, one of the guys he fought against was McClellan, who was in West Virginia. And the two men kind of sized each other up. But McClellan misunderstood Lee. Remember I told you he was called Granny Lee. He had retreated from, well, McClellan's forces. Well, that's because Lee didn't think his army was ready for battle. So McClellan thought about Lee that he was timid in battle. There's a great quote, which I don't have time to read to you. Everything McClellan says about Lee was true about him, that he's a nice guy, but he doesn't like to fight. And they're like, that's McClellan, you're talking about yourself. Lee, on the other hand, recognized, I know McClellan well, and he did. And he launches what's known as the 7 Days Battle. Now, it's 5 battles over 7 days. Well, there's one more battle that starts at the beginning, but really, Lee attacks 5 different times on 7 days. Now, if you go back to how you win or lose, I know it's kind of course. But in the winning and losing, the Union Army wins 4 of the 5 battles. Unfortunately, McClellan retreated every day. 4 of the 5 battles, he's the winner, meaning he should have pressed his advantage. In fact, there's moments in this where Stonewall Jackson, who he becomes famous, right? Everybody's like, oh, Stonewall Jackson. He messes up. He's late to the battle. There's moments where Lee's not really sharp. He's not fighting well. The last battle is actually a horrible battle. Lee should have never attack the uphill against fortified positions. They get decimated. And as you can see there at the bottom of the slide, the overall casualty is kind of flipped from Shiloh. The Confederacy on these battles loses a lot more troops than the Union. Unfortunately, McClellan was the kind of person who would just retreat and retreat and retreat. So disappointing and frustrating because the war could have gone differently. However, another thought, if he takes Richmond in 62, does that mean there's no Emancipation Proclamation? Because Lincoln is not certain what he wants to do here. Now, this moment, the Peninsula Campaign, the Battle of Seven Pines, and the 7 Days battles changes the war. We move into a whole new phase, which we will pick up next time. Lee recognizes now he cannot play defense. They have to go offensively. And of course, knowing his history, he knows the Confederacy has to find their own Battle of Saratoga. Remember, Saratoga in 1777 was the battle or the victory that France needed to see before they would agree to help the rebellion against Britain by the American patriots. So he knows England needs to see a battle, not where we're in defense and we're winning, but we're in offense, and we didn't win Shiloh, so he knows he got to find it. And so Lee will basically begin to think of a plan that will be his first northern advance. Lincoln is aware of this possibility, and he's so frustrated with McClellan, he relieves him of duty, although there's a pretty large army sitting down the peninsula. This is one of the great strategic moments, right? There's this large army of probably now 80,000 men of some various abilities at that point, and they're on the peninsula, and Lee will leave them there and head north. And at no point does Lincoln or McClellan or anybody else go, now they've left, attack. Instead, they just sort of sulk away. It's so frustrating to watch. But again, it's kind of important because we know the Emancipation Proclamation will play a key role, perhaps not the role you think it does, in what happens with slavery. So let me show you one more slide as we go along the way. Since the last moment when we started talking, in 61, Lincoln is saying, hey, no Emancipation Proclamation. But Congress is acting. Congress is heavily Republican because the Democrats, or the South Democrats are gone, right? So in April, they abolish slavery. For the very first time in our national history, Congress will decide it can make a law about property if it involves other humans, and that they will abolish slavery in DC. It's a shocking move, and Lincoln does not veto it. He signs off on it. But then in May, another general offers an Emancipation Proclamation where he is, General Hunter, and Lincoln says, no, don't do that. But by June, so the next month basically after the debacle of the 7 Days Battle, Lincoln is like, we're going to have to do something. And he begins to see that the broad emancipation in some level, particularly with the rebellious states, must be a possibility. In fact, it could be a necessity. And he begins to kind of go there. And as you can see in July, he tells his cabinet, I think I'm going to do this. Now, this is not the total story involving Lincoln and slavery. We're going to pick that up next time, because in the meantime, Lee is not waiting. Lee is going off looking for his own battle of Saratoga. He wants to try to pull off a way to convince England to get in. And of course, he's not afraid of what's going to happen. And he actually knows, and we'll go to the slide, I'll come back to this next time. If you look at this, England in Parliament is saying, hey, look, they've made a nation. We should do this. Napoleon III, who's now at that moment the Emperor of France, he says, I think it's time for us to recognize the South. And he's asking his French minister in London, let's get it, let's do this. And remember, for England, this would be good for them, because one of the challenges is England at the current time, the world power, is a large united North America that they don't control, like they control the northern part, Canada, is probably going to be a rival that will defeat them in the next century or at the end of this century in money, in economy, money, industry, people, military strength. And you remember from 1776 all the way to this moment, we're not friends with England. This whole idea that people talk about today that England's our longest lasting friend. Oh, no. We've not been friends till the 20th century. So we were rivals and enemies to a large degree all the way through the 19th century. So Link, I'm gonna show you this slide next time. Lee we're on the precipice. If we can pull off our own Saratoga, we can get it. And Lincoln sees it too. He's like, oh my gosh, what are we gonna do? And he tries to get another army ready. It's not going to go well. So man, things are in a brand new spot. And that's where we are at the end or midway through 1862. And we're heading into a new moment that Lee is going to kind of show us. They're going to come as close as possible to winning. Don't fall prey to the mythology. I know Gettysburg's the sexy battle. Everybody loves Gettysburg. It's not as important as people like to think it is. This will be the moment next week where we'll see where Lee is so close to trying to get what he needs. I appreciate you guys so much. Feel free to send me a question. If you're watching this in some other capacity besides right here, write a note in the comments or something, but email me. I'd love to get your questions, and if I can answer any questions for you, Becca can send them to me. Appreciate you guys so, so much. I wish we had time again for our normal Q&A like I like to do when we're there. Thank you so much, and I'm going to stop the share and get you guys out of here. Thank you so much, everybody.